Welcome back to the Cartoon Codex. Today we're diving into something that shouldn't technically exist. The complete timeline of The Simpsons. And when I say complete, I mean we're going from the founding of Springfield in 1796 all the way through multiple contradictory futures set decades from now. We're talking about a show where the main characters have been the same age for over 35 years. Where Grandpa Simpson fought in World War II, despite the math making that increasingly impossible, and where Homer and Marge somehow met in both 1974 and the 1990s, depending on which episode you're watching. The Simpsons operates on what's called a floating timeline, which is a fancy way of saying the show exists in a perpetual present, where the past keeps getting rewritten to stay relevant, and Homer and Marge were teenagers in the 70s when the show started in 1989. But later episodes moved their youth to the 90s, and more recent episodes have pushed it even further forward. Bart has been 10 years old since 1989, meaning he's now spent more years being 10 than most real people spend in their entire childhoods. Lisa has been 8 for over 3 decades. Maggie has been a baby longer than some viewers have been alive. And yet, the show has given us incredibly detailed glimpses into both the past and the future, creating a timeline that's simultaneously non-existent and remarkably well developed. What makes The Simpsons timeline fascinating isn't just the contradictions, though there are plenty of those. It's how the show has used time as a storytelling device to explore American life across multiple generations. Episodes like Lisa's Wedding showed us a future where Lisa was getting married in 2010 to a British academic named Hugh Parkfield. Bart to the Future depicted Bart as a struggling musician living with Ralph Wiggum, while Lisa became President of the United States. Holidays of Future Past gave us an even further look ahead to 2041, with Bart divorced from Gender and struggling to connect with his 2 sons, while Lisa, married to Milhouse, dealt with her rebellious daughter. The show has jumped forward and backward through time more than a malfunctioning DeLorean, and somehow it all adds to the charm rather than destroying the continuity. Today, we're going to attempt the impossible. We're going to piece together the entire history of Springfield and the Simpson family, from the ancient past through the contested present and into multiple possible futures. We'll explore how a pirate became a founding father, how Abraham Simpson served in wars he mathematically couldn't have fought in, how Homer and Marge's love story keeps getting rewritten, and what might happen to Bart and Lisa when they finally grow up. We'll look at the contradictions, the retcons, and the moments where the show's writers just said forget it and did whatever they wanted. This is going to be a deep dive into the temporal mess that is The Simpsons, where characters don't age, the past keeps changing, and the future has been predicted at least 5 different ways. So settle in, because we're about to explore every era of Springfield history, from the moment Jebediah Springfield allegedly killed a bear with his bare hands to the moment Maggie Simpson becomes a rock star grandmother. Let's get started with how it all began. Before Springfield, ancient history. The history of Springfield begins long before any Simpsons set foot in the town. In fact, it begins before the town even existed. According to various episodes throughout the series, the land that would become Springfield has a rich and often violent history stretching back thousands of years. Native Americans lived on this land for centuries, leaving behind burial grounds that would later cause problems for modern developers. The show has referenced these indigenous populations multiple times, usually when construction projects unearth artifacts or when characters need to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth about how American towns were really founded. but the official founding of Springfield, as we know it, happened on February the 25th, 1796. A man calling himself Jebediah Springfield led a group of settlers from Maryland to establish a new community built on what they believed were solid Puritan values. These pioneers had left Maryland searching for what their leader described as New Sodom, though this was apparently based on a misinterpretation of a Bible passage. They were determined to create a town where people could live according to strict moral principles, which makes it pretty ironic that modern Springfield became known as America's worst city. And the story gets more interesting when you learn who Jebediah Springfield really was. According to Lisa's research in the episode Lisa the Iconoclast, his real name was Hans Sprungfeld, and he wasn't a noble pioneer at all. The evidence suggests he was a vicious pirate who had attempted to assassinate George Washington. Lisa discovered what appeared to be Jebediah's secret confession while researching Springfield's history for an essay contest. The document indicated he had been a murderous criminal who assumed a false identity to escape his past. When Lisa examined Jebediah's remains, she found he literally had a silver tongue, which, based on the confession, he had used to tell lies rather than inspire people. The most famous story about Jebediah Springfield involves him killing a bear with his bare hands in 1838. This heroic deed has been commemorated with a statue in the town square that shows Jebediah wrestling a massive bear. Generations of Springfield citizens have grown up believing in the courage and strength of their founder, but historians eventually determined that the bear probably killed Jebediah, not the other way around. The statue remains anyway, because the myth serves the town better than the truth. This pattern of Springfield embracing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths runs throughout the town's entire history. The founding of Springfield came with built-in conflict because it wasn't the only town established by that group of pioneers. Shelbyville was founded at the same time by a man named Shelbyville, Manhattan, who had a fundamental disagreement with Jebediah Springfield about the direction their community should take. Manhattan believed that people should have the freedom to marry their cousins if they wanted to. This wasn't just a throwaway joke. It was apparently a serious philosophical difference that split the group. Those who agreed with Manhattan went on to found Shelbyville, while those who sided with Springfield built the town that bears his name. This created a rivalry that has lasted over 200 years, with Springfield and Shelbyville competing over everything from sports to civic pride. The early years of Springfield were marked by the same violence and expansion that characterized much of American frontier history. The town grew as more settlers arrived, drawn by promises of land and opportunity. They built homes, established businesses, and created the basic infrastructure of civilization. But this growth came at a cost. The Native Americans who had lived on this land for generations were pushed out, their burial grounds paved over, their history erased or reduced to tourist attractions. The show has acknowledged this uncomfortable history multiple times, usually through Lisa pointing out the moral implications of what Springfield represents. Springfield's location has always been deliberately vague. The show's creator, Matt Groening, named it after Springfield, Oregon, but he's also said he wanted it to represent any American town. Over the decades, the show has dropped contradictory clues about where Springfield might be located. Some episodes suggest it's near the East Coast, while others place it near mountains that look suspiciously like the Rockies. There are references to it being close to both oceans, having 4 distinct seasons, and somehow bordering states that don't actually border each other. This geographic impossibility is part of the joke. Springfield exists everywhere and nowhere. making it the perfect setting for America's most satirical family. The town's early economy was built on whatever industries the writers needed for that week's episode. There have been references to logging, mining, agriculture, and early manufacturing. What's consistent is that Springfield has always been a working-class town, never quite achieving the prosperity or prestige of its neighbors. Even in its earliest days, Springfield seemed destined to become what it eventually did, a struggling community full of people trying to get by while dealing with corrupt politicians, environmental disasters, and the occasional mob uprising. One crucial aspect of early Springfield history involves the Stonecutters, a secret society that's been around since at least 495 AD, according to some references. This ancient organization has supposedly controlled Springfield's development from behind the scenes, making decisions about who gets power and who gets crushed. They've influenced everything from elections to who gets good parking spots. The Stonecutters represent another layer of Springfield's hidden history, the secret forces that shaped the town, while ordinary citizens remained oblivious. The mythology surrounding Jebediah Springfield grew over the decades following the town's founding. Stories about his bravery, his wisdom, and his moral character became part of Springfield's civic religion. Children learned about him in school, and politicians invoked his name when they needed to appeal to traditional values. His birthday became a town holiday complete with parades and reenactments. The fact that it was all based on lies didn't matter. What mattered was that Springfield needed heroes, and Jebediah provided that heroic foundation, even if he had to be fictional to do it. This period also saw the establishment of many institutions that would define Springfield for centuries to come. The church was built, giving Reverend Lovejoy's ancestors a place to preach. The first tavern opened, beginning a long tradition of Springfield men drinking away their problems. Schools were established to educate the town's children, though the quality of that education has apparently been questionable from the start. Law enforcement was organized, creating a police force that has been corrupt and incompetent since day one, if later episodes are any indication. The early settlers brought with them all the prejudices and problems of their era. There are references throughout the series to Springfield's ugly history with slavery, discrimination, and violence against anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable. These dark chapters don't get discussed much in modern Springfield, which prefers to focus on the sanitized myth of noble pioneers building a shining city. But that history lurks beneath the surface, occasionally breaking through in episodes that deal with the town's complicated past. The 19th century. Building a town. As Springfield moved into the 1800s, the town began to take on the character that would define it for the next 2 centuries. And this was the era when many of the buildings that still stand in modern Springfield were constructed, when the town's great families established themselves, and when Springfield's reputation as a place where things go wrong first started to develop. It was also the period when we first see members of the Simpson family appearing in Springfield's historical record. The Civil War era brought significant changes to Springfield. While the show has been deliberately vague about which side Springfield fought on, there are references to the town being divided during the conflict. The episode The Color Yellow revealed crucial information about the Simpson family during this period. In 1860, a woman named Eliza Simpson was married to a man named Hiram Simpson. They were living on a plantation where Hiram served Colonel Burns, an ancestor of the modern Montgomery Burns. This already tells us that the Burns family has been wealthy and morally questionable for at least 160 years. On April 14th, 1860, Eliza Simpson made a decision that would change her family's history. She helped a slave named Virgil escape to freedom in Canada. This was an act of tremendous courage and moral clarity, especially considering the risks involved. When Hiram discovered what Eliza had done, he told Colonel Burns that Virgil was hiding in the turnip shed, betraying both his wife and the escaping slave to save his own skin. But Eliza's mother, Mabel Simpson, confronted Colonel Burns with a shotgun and helped Virgil escape. The story gets even more interesting from there. Based on what the episode shows us, Eliza and Virgil fell in love, and she left Hiram to be with him. They fled to Canada together, where they could be safe from slave catchers and where their relationship would be legal. On December 26, 1860, Mabel Simpson and Virgil got married. This union created a branch of the Simpson family tree that included both white and black heritage. The episode The Color Yellow indicates that Abraham Simpson I was born in 1861, establishing the generation that would eventually lead to Grandpa Simpson and then to Homer. This period of Simpson family history is significant for several reasons. It shows that the Simpsons have never been wealthy or powerful. They've always been working-class people making difficult moral choices. It demonstrates that the family has a history of standing up against injustice, even when it cost them everything. Eliza gave up her marriage, her social standing, and her security to help Virgil and eventually be with him. That kind of moral courage doesn't appear often in the Simpson family tree. But when it does, it tends to be the women making the brave choices. The Burns family's history during this same period shows a very different trajectory. Colonel Burns owned slaves and prospered from their labor. He was willing to hunt down escaped slaves and punish those who helped them. This established a pattern that would continue through generations of the Burns family. They would accumulate wealth through exploitation. They would use their power to crush anyone who opposed them, and they would face minimal consequences for their actions. The dynamic between the Simpson and Burns families was set during the Civil War era, and it hasn't changed much in the 160 years since. After the Civil War, Springfield went through the same reconstruction and industrial development that transformed much of America. Factories were built, railroads came through town, and Springfield began to shift from an agricultural community to something more urban. The population grew as immigrants arrived looking for work. This influx of new residents brought diversity to Springfield, but also tension, as different ethnic groups competed for jobs and resources. Many of the prejudices and divisions that plague modern Springfield have their roots in this period of rapid change. As the late 1800s saw the establishment of many businesses and institutions that would become Springfield landmarks. The Simpson and Delilah department store opened, though this would eventually go out of business. Various factories started operations, providing employment, but also creating the environmental problems that would plague the town for generations. The Springfield Shopper newspaper began publication, starting a long tradition of mediocre journalism. And somewhere during this period, the traditions and quirks that make Springfield unique began to take hold. One particularly dark tradition that started in 1924 was Whacking Day, celebrated every May 10th. According to what the show reveals in the episode Whacking Day, this began as an excuse to beat up Irish immigrants, but eventually transformed into a day when the townspeople would gather to club snakes to death. The fact that this incredibly violent and pointless tradition lasted until the 1990s says something about Springfield's resistance to progress. Lisa Simpson would eventually expose Whacking Day for the barbaric practice it was, getting it banned. But for almost 70 years, the town enthusiastically participated in mass snake murder without questioning why. The Simpson family during this period remained working class and largely unremarkable. They weren't founding major businesses or achieving great fame. They were farmers, laborers, and tradespeople who worked hard, struggled to make ends meet, and passed down a legacy of perseverance, if not prosperity. Each generation of Simpsons seemed to hope that the next generation would do better, would achieve more, would finally break the cycle of barely getting by. And each generation ended up in roughly the same place as the one before, which is probably why Homer didn't seem shocked when he ended up working at a nuclear plant, despite dreaming of being something more. The architecture of Springfield that we see in the modern show largely dates from this period. The town square, with its statue of Jebediah Springfield, was designed and built during the late 1800s. Many of the older buildings that line the streets were constructed during this era, using the materials and techniques available at the time. These structures have survived into the present through what can only be called miraculous neglect, as since Springfield doesn't seem to maintain its infrastructure very well. Buildings that should have collapsed decades ago continue standing, which is either a testament to 19th century construction quality or just cartoon logic. By the end of the 1800s, Springfield had established itself as a minor American city, with all the problems and possibilities that entailed. It had a functioning government, even if that government was already showing signs of corruption. It had schools educating children, though not particularly well. It had churches providing spiritual guidance, even if many residents ignored that guidance. It had businesses creating jobs, though those jobs didn't pay well. In short, Springfield had become exactly what it would remain for the next century and beyond: a struggling town full of people trying to make the best of imperfect circumstances. The early 20th century, wars and depression, the early 1900s brought massive changes to Springfield and to the Simpson family specifically. This was the era when Abraham Simpson II, better known as Grandpa Simpson, was born and lived through some of the most tumultuous periods in American history. This is also where the Simpsons timeline starts to break down completely, because Grandpa's age and backstory have become increasingly impossible as the show has continued. Let's talk about when Grandpa was actually born, because this is where things get complicated. In various episodes, Grandpa has claimed to be 83 years old. Other episodes have celebrated his 87th birthday. There are references suggesting he was born as early as 1907 and as late as 1934. The problem is that none of these dates work with everything else we know about his life. Working backwards from his stated age of 83 when the show started in 1989, he would have been born in 1906, making him 35 when World War II started. But later episodes suggest he was much younger during the war, creating an impossible situation where the dates simply don't align no matter how you calculate them. What we do know is that Grandpa claimed to have been born in what he calls the old country, which he says he can't remember, but which is heavily implied to be the United Kingdom or Ireland. How he immigrated to America as a young child with his parents, Orville Simpson and Yuma Hickman. They briefly lived inside the Statue of Liberty, which is either a joke or a commentary on immigrant housing conditions. From there, the family moved to what would become Grandpa's childhood home on Simpson Mountain, an area that seems to be a parody of the Walton setting during the Great Depression. Grandpa's childhood was defined by poverty and hardship. He grew up during the Depression, watching his father struggle to keep the farm running while the economy collapsed around them. There are references to the family being so poor they had to eat their horses, their furniture, and at one point possibly even each other, though that last one is hopefully just Grandpa's senility talking. This level of poverty left deep scars on Abraham Simpson. I made him cheap, suspicious of wealth, and deeply resentful of people like Montgomery Burns, who sailed through the Depression without suffering. The 1930s were apparently quite eventful for young Abe Simpson. He claims to have participated in the Berlin Olympics in 1936, competing in javelin. According to his story, his throw narrowly missed Hitler, who was watching in the stands, but instead hit the man who was about to assassinate the German leader. Whether this actually happened or is just another one of Grandpa's tall tales is impossible to say. The show leaves it deliberately ambiguous whether his stories are true, exaggerated, or complete fiction. Then came World War II, and this is where Grandpa's timeline really falls apart. Abraham Simpson served in the war as a sergeant in a unit called the Flying Hellfish. This much seems to be confirmed by multiple episodes and consistent references. He fought alongside other Springfield residents, including Sheldon Skinner, Arnie Gumble, and yes, Montgomery Burns. The Flying Hellfish saw action in Europe, participated in important battles, and at the end of the war managed to steal a collection of valuable artworks from surrendering German forces. The Flying Hellfish formed what's called a tontine, an agreement where the last surviving member would get all the stolen art. This became important decades later when Burns, as the second to last survivor, tried to murder Grandpa to claim the treasure, and the episode Raging Abe Simpson and his grumbling grandson in The Curse of the Flying Hellfish built an entire storyline around this wartime agreement, showing in detail how these men fought together and made this pact that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But here's the problem with Grandpa being a World War II veteran. When the show started in 1989, having a character who fought in World War II made perfect sense. Plenty of veterans from that war were still alive, still telling their stories, still dealing with their trauma. But as the years went on and the show's floating timeline moved the present forward, Grandpa's service became increasingly impossible. If he's supposed to be 83 in the current timeline, and the current year keeps moving forward, and then he would have been born too late to serve in World War II. Season 36's episode Abe League of Their Mo essentially abandoned the concept of Grandpa being a World War II veteran entirely. The show's creators realized that maintaining this aspect of his character had become mathematically absurd. If Grandpa aged realistically after World War II, he would now be well over 100 years old, which would break the illusion that The Simpsons takes place in a contemporary setting. So the show quietly retconned one of its most established character traits, sacrificing continuity for relevance. This creates a massive hole in The Simpsons timeline, because so many episodes and character moments were built around Grandpa's war service. His relationship with Burns, his trauma from combat, his status as a veteran in Springfield, his membership in the Flying Hellfish, all of these elements defined his character for decades. Removing them means either ignoring those old episodes or accepting that they no longer fit with current continuity. The show chose to just keep moving forward and hope nobody thought about it too hard. Grandpa also apparently served in other conflicts. He's mentioned being in World War I, though he would have had to lie about his age to enlist since he claims he was just a child. There are references to him serving in the Korean War as well, and in some episodes, he's shown serving in the Navy, sometimes as a pilot on an aircraft carrier with his brother Cyrus. The details change depending on what story the writers want to tell. His military service is simultaneously the most important and most inconsistent part of his background. And after the war, Grandpa returned to civilian life and tried to build a normal existence. He married a woman named Mona, who would become Homer's mother. The timeline of when they married and when Homer was born shifts depending on the episode. But what's consistent is that Grandpa struggled to readjust to peacetime. He worked various jobs, none of them particularly successful. He tried farming until he lost the farm. He was briefly a professional wrestler called Glamorous Godfrey. He worked security jobs. He even claims to have worked in Hollywood as an animation writer, though this is probably another fabrication. Grandpa's relationship with Mona was complicated and would eventually end in tragedy. She was a free spirit who got involved in radical politics during the 60s, while Grandpa was a conservative military man who couldn't understand her activism. This fundamental incompatibility would eventually drive them apart, especially after Mona went underground to avoid arrest for destroying Montgomery Burns' biological weapons laboratory. Grandpa raised Homer largely as a single father, which might explain some of Homer's issues. The Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war period fundamentally shaped Abraham Simpson's character. He became bitter, resentful, and prone to rambling stories that may or may not be true. He developed a deep suspicion of authority figures like Burns, while simultaneously believing in traditional American values. He loved his country, but felt betrayed by how it treated veterans. He wanted better for his son, but didn't know how to provide it. In many ways, Grandpa represents an entire generation of men who fought for their nation, returned home expecting gratitude, and instead got forgotten. Homer and Marge. The origin story. Now we come to the heart of the Simpsons timeline. The story of how Homer Simpson and Marge Bouvier met, fell in love, and created the family that would become the center of the show. This is also where the floating timeline becomes most obvious, because the show has retold their origin story multiple times, with completely different dates and circumstances, but there are certain core elements that remain consistent across most versions. Homer J. Simpson was born on May 12, 1956, according to what's shown on his driver's license in multiple episodes. This would make him around 33 years old when the show started in 1989, which lines up with references to his age in early episodes. Based on what we see throughout the series, Homer grew up in Springfield as the only son of Abraham and Mona Simpson. His childhood was marked by neglect, poverty, and emotional abuse from a father who loved him but had no idea how to show it in healthy ways. Young Homer was not a bright child. He struggled in school from the beginning, showing little aptitude for academics or athletics. There are references to him being held back at least once, and his grades were consistently terrible. But he had dreams. He wanted to be special, to achieve something great, to make his parents proud. These dreams would be systematically crushed over the years, turning the optimistic boy into the defeated man we see as an adult. The moment Homer lost his potential is hard to pinpoint, but it happened gradually through countless small disappointments. Marge Bouvier was also born in 1956, making her the same age as Homer. She grew up in a very different environment. While Homer's house was chaotic and neglectful, Marge's was strict and traditional. Her parents, Clancy and Jacqueline Bouvier, raised her and her sisters Patty and Selma with clear expectations about how young women should behave. Marge was the good daughter, the one who followed the rules and tried to please everyone. This people-pleasing tendency would define much of her life. Unlike Homer, Marge was a good student. She was conscientious, hard-working, and determined to get an education. She had dreams of going to college, maybe becoming somebody important. But those dreams would be derailed by a chance meeting in detention during her senior year of high school. Everything changed for Marge the day she met Homer Simpson, though she didn't realize it at the time. The episode The Way We Was gives us the definitive version of how Homer and Marge met, at least according to early Simpsons continuity. It's set in 1974, when both Homer and Marge were seniors at Springfield High School. One day, Homer and his best friend Barney Gumble were sent to detention for smoking in the boys' bathroom. This wasn't unusual for Homer, who had become a troublemaker and underachiever by this point. What was unusual was who else ended up in detention that day. Marge had attended a feminist rally where she burned her bra as a political statement, and this act of rebellion was completely out of character for the normally reserved Marge Bouvier. But the 70s were a time when even good girls sometimes challenged authority. Mrs. Dondelinger, the school principal, decided this warranted punishment and sent Marge to detention for the day. When she walked into that room and Homer saw her for the first time, something fundamental shifted in his universe. Homer fell in love with Marge instantly and completely. It wasn't just physical attraction, though he definitely found her beautiful with her towering blue hair and kind eyes. It was something deeper. Maybe he recognized in her the stability he'd never had at home. Maybe he saw someone who could make him better. Maybe it was just chemistry. Whatever the reason, from that moment on, Homer was determined to make Marge his girlfriend, and despite the obvious fact that she was completely out of his league. His first attempt to get close to her involved joining the debate team, since Marge was a member. Homer had never shown any interest in debate before and had no talent for it whatsoever. But it gave him an excuse to be near Marge, to watch her, to try to impress her. This didn't work particularly well, especially since Marge seemed much more interested in Artie Ziff, a smart and articulate student who actually belonged on the debate team. Homer's next strategy was more deceptive. He pretended to be a French student who needed tutoring. Knowing that Marge would volunteer to help him, she agreed to tutor him, and they spent evenings together at her house. While Homer pretended to struggle with French vocabulary, he was never actually studying. And these sessions gave Homer what he really wanted: time alone with Marge, a chance to make her laugh, opportunities to show her he was more than just the class screw-up. Eventually, Homer worked up the courage to ask Marge to the senior prom. She initially agreed, genuinely enjoying their time together, even if she saw him more as a friend than a romantic prospect. But then Homer's deception fell apart. Marge discovered he wasn't actually taking French class, that he'd lied to her from the beginning just to spend time with her. She felt betrayed and hurt, not because the lie was malicious, but because it showed that Homer didn't think the real him was good enough to deserve her time. Marge told Homer she wouldn't go to prom with him after all. She was angry about the dishonesty and confused about her feelings. When Artie Ziff asked her to prom the next day, she said yes. This was partly revenge against Homer for lying, partly genuine interest in Artie, and partly a desire to go with someone her sisters would approve of. Artie was smart, successful, and clearly had a bright future ahead of him. Homer was none of those things. Prom night was torture for Homer. He still went, having already paid for his tuxedo rental and limousine. But he went alone, watching from the sidelines as Marge danced with Artie, as they were crowned prom king and queen, as they shared what looked like a perfect romantic evening. Homer stood in the hallway crying, convinced he'd lost his chance at the only happiness he'd ever really wanted. When Marge came out and found him there, he poured his heart out to her, explaining exactly what she meant to him. Marge listened to Homer's confession with sympathy, but told him gently that she was with Artie now. She genuinely cared about Homer, but she'd made her choice. The night seemed to be over for Homer, his last chance at Marge slipping away as she returned to the dance. After the prom ended, Artie drove Marge to Inspiration Point, a make-out spot overlooking Springfield. What happened next would change everything. Artie tried to initiate a romantic encounter, becoming increasingly aggressive when Marge hesitated. In what the show describes as a fit of passion, Artie tore Marge's dress and tried to force himself on her. Marge demanded he stop immediately and take her home. Artie complied, but the damage was done. The perfect gentleman Marge thought she was dating had revealed himself to be someone who didn't respect her boundaries. She felt violated, foolish, and deeply disappointed. As Artie drove away, Marge was about to enter her house when she overheard her parents talking through the door. They were discussing how lucky Marge was to have gone to prom with someone like Artie instead of that awful Homer Simpson. Hearing her parents trash Homer, seeing how they valued status over character, made Marge realize something important. She got in her car and drove until she found Homer walking home alone, having run out of limo time and too poor to afford a cab. Marge pulled over and offered Homer a ride. She told him she was sorry, that she should have gone to prom with him, that she'd made a mistake. Homer listened to her apology and then did something that defined their entire relationship going forward. He took out the corsage he'd bought for her, and the one he'd been carrying around all night, despite having no one to give it to, and used it to fix the torn strap on her dress. Then he made her a promise. He told her he would never let her go, and he never did. This is the foundation of Homer and Marge's relationship. She chose him over someone objectively better on paper. He worshipped her and dedicated himself to making her happy. She accepted him completely, flaws and all. He never stopped trying to be worthy of her. This dynamic, established on prom night in 1974, would define their marriage for the next several decades. Every time Homer screwed up, which was often, Marge would remember the boy who used a corsage to fix her dress and promised to never let her go. After prom, Homer and Marge became a couple. They dated throughout the rest of high school and continued their relationship after graduation. Homer got a job at a miniature golf course, while Marge worked various positions to save money for college. They were young, in love, and convinced that their feelings for each other would overcome any obstacles. This optimism would be tested sooner than they expected. But here's where the Simpsons timeline starts to fracture. The episode That 90s Show retconned much of this backstory by showing Homer and Marge as a childless couple living together in the 1990s, with Homer in a grunge band and Marge attending university. This directly contradicted established continuity, showing them meeting in the 70s and having Bart in the early 80s, and the episode was widely criticized by fans and reviewers for ignoring decades of established history. The show's writers have mostly treated That 90s Show as non-canon in subsequent episodes, but it exists as evidence of how the Simpsons timeline can be rewritten whenever it becomes inconvenient. There's also the episode The Way We Weren't, which revealed that Homer and Marge actually met much earlier, at summer camp when they were 10 years old. Homer used a fake name and wore an eye patch, so Marge didn't recognize him years later when they met again in high school. This wasn't exactly a retcon, so much as an addition to their backstory, giving their relationship even deeper roots. It suggested that Homer and Marge were somehow destined to be together, that they'd been drawn to each other even as children. What remains consistent across most versions is that Homer loved Marge completely from the moment he saw her, that she eventually chose him over more conventionally suitable partners, and that their relationship has survived primarily through her patience and his devotion. These core truths define the Simpson marriage, regardless of when or how many times they actually met. The marriage and early family. After high school, Homer and Marge continued dating while trying to figure out their futures. Homer bounced between low-paying jobs, never quite finding his calling. Marge put her college dreams on hold to work and helped support them both. They were young, poor, and deeply in love in that specific way people are before life's responsibilities fully hit. Their relationship during this period was defined by small romantic gestures, cheap dates, and dreams about a future that seemed both exciting and terrifying. Then, in 1980, everything changed. According to the episode I Married Marge, Homer was working at the miniature golf course when he and Marge had sex in one of the attraction's castle structures. This unplanned intimate encounter resulted in Marge becoming pregnant with their first child. The episode establishes this timing by showing Homer and Marge watching The Empire Strikes Back in theaters, which was released in May 1980, helping to date when Bart was conceived. When Marge discovered she was carrying Homer's baby, she faced a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of her life. She could have the baby alone, try to get an abortion, or ask Homer to step up and become a father. Homer's reaction when Marge told him she was pregnant revealed everything about his character. He was terrified, completely unprepared, and had no idea how to support a family. But he never once considered abandoning Marge or the baby. Instead, he immediately asked her to marry him. It wasn't a romantic proposal with a ring and flowers. It was a panicked but sincere commitment from a young man who loved this woman and wanted to do right by her, even though he had no idea how. Marge and Homer got married in a small chapel across the state line. Marge was visibly pregnant during the ceremony, which would have been scandalous in an earlier era, but was fairly common by 1980. There was no fancy wedding, no big reception, just two scared kids making vows to each other while a baby grew inside Marge's belly, and her sisters Patty and Selma attended and made their disapproval of Homer crystal clear. They told Marge she was making a huge mistake, that Homer would drag her down, that she deserved better. Marge married him anyway. The early months of their marriage were defined by financial struggles. Homer's job at the miniature golf course didn't pay enough to support a family. He went out looking for better work, but discovered that having no education and no skills made finding decent employment nearly impossible. The stress of impending fatherhood, poverty, and Marge's pregnancy put tremendous pressure on their new marriage. There were moments when it seemed like they might not make it. One particularly difficult period saw Homer leave Marge temporarily because he felt like he was failing her. He couldn't provide the life she deserved. He couldn't give their baby what it would need. Couldn't even afford basic necessities. Marge was patient during this time, working while pregnant and trying to hold everything together. She believed in Homer, even when he didn't believe in himself. This pattern, Marge's faith sustaining Homer through his moments of failure, would repeat throughout their entire marriage. Eventually, Homer found work at the Springfield nuclear power plant, This job came about through a deal Abraham Simpson had made with Montgomery Burns years earlier, where Burns agreed to give Homer a position in exchange for something Grandpa had done during the war. The job paid better than anything Homer had done before, though it still wasn't much. More importantly, it had benefits, including health insurance that would cover Marge's pregnancy and the birth. Our Homer took the job and committed himself to keeping it, no matter how much he hated working for Burns. Bart Simpson was born on April 1st, 1980, based on the timeline established in I Married Marge, though some episodes suggest it was 1982 or even later, depending on when the floating timeline places the current year. Naming him Bart, which Homer revealed was an anagram for brat, should have been a warning about what kind of child he'd be. From the beginning, Bart was energetic, rebellious, and constantly getting into trouble. Homer had been hoping for a child he could mold into the son he never got to be. Instead, he got a miniature version of his own worst qualities with even less impulse control. The family's early years with baby Bart were chaotic. They were living in a small apartment, barely making ends meet, even with Homer's nuclear plant salary. Marge stayed home with Bart, sacrificing any remaining dreams of college or career to be a full-time mother. Homer worked long hours at a job he didn't understand, frequently falling asleep or causing minor disasters through his incompetence. But somehow, they survived. They were poor, stressed, and exhausted, but they were together. Homer eventually earned enough for a down payment on a house. The property at 742 Evergreen Terrace became available, and the Simpsons jumped at the chance to own their own home. It wasn't much, a modest 2-story house in a middle-class neighborhood, but it represented stability and achievement to Homer. He'd managed to provide his family with a real home, which was more than his own father had done for much of his childhood. The house would become the center of the Simpson family's world. 2 years after Bart was born, Marge became pregnant again. This time it was planned, or at least less of a surprise. Marge wanted Bart to have a sibling and convinced Homer that they could afford another child. Lisa Marie Simpson was born on May 9th, 1982, though again, the exact year shifts with the timeline as the show continues. Where Bart was chaotic and destructive, Lisa was thoughtful and creative. She showed signs of genius from an early age, much to Homer's confusion. He didn't know how to relate to a daughter who was smarter than him, who asked questions he couldn't answer, who wanted things he didn't understand. Lisa's birth shifted the family dynamics considerably. Bart was no longer the only child demanding attention. Homer now had 2 kids to provide for on his meager salary. Marge had to balance the needs of a rambunctious boy and a sensitive girl who required very different types of care. The house felt smaller with 4 people living in it. Money got tighter. Stress increased. But Marge insisted the family was better for having both children, and deep down Homer agreed even when Bart and Lisa were driving him crazy. For a few years, the Simpson family consisted of 4 people, 2 parents and 2 children living in their Evergreen Terrace house. This was supposed to be it, the complete family unit they'd spend the rest of their lives as. Homer had gotten a vasectomy to ensure no more accidental pregnancies. Marge was satisfied with her 2 children. They settled into a routine of work, school, and family dinners. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Then Marge got pregnant again. How this happened despite Homer's vasectomy is never fully explained, though the implication is that the procedure was done cheaply and incorrectly. Marge's third pregnancy was completely unplanned and unwanted, at least initially. Homer panicked because they were already stretched thin financially with 2 kids. How would they afford a third? How would they fit another person in their small house? His reaction to Marge's pregnancy announcement was not what she'd hoped for. Margaret Maggie Simpson was born sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. Based on when And Maggie Makes 3 places these events, though like everything else, the exact timing depends on which episode you trust. That episode deals explicitly with her conception and birth, showing how Homer had briefly quit the nuclear plant to work at a bowling alley, doing a job he actually enjoyed. But Marge's pregnancy forced him to return to the plant and ask for his old position back. Montgomery Burns agreed to rehire Homer, but made him post a demotivational plaque in his workspace that read, "Don't forget you're here forever." This plaque became a symbol of Homer's trapped existence, working a job he hated to support a family that kept growing. Maggie's arrival completed the Simpson family as we know them from the show. 5 people living at 742 Evergreen Terrace, struggling to pay bills, dealing with daily chaos, but ultimately bound together by love and shared history. This was the family unit that would remain frozen in time for the next 35 years, and counting. Bart would stay 10, Elisa would stay 8, Maggie would stay a baby, Homer and Marge would remain in their mid-30s, and the timeline would begin its endless loop of the perpetual present. The present day, seasons 1 through 36, when The Simpsons premiered as a half-hour show on December 17th, 1989. It established a present-day setting that exists in a strange temporal limbo. The show takes place now, whenever now happens to be. In 1989, the present was 1989. In 2025, the present is 2025. The characters don't age. The core family dynamics don't fundamentally change, but the world around them constantly updates to reflect contemporary culture, technology, and social issues. And this present-day setting has created what amounts to an eternal now for the Simpson family. Season 1 showed them dealing with issues from the late 80s, from the Cold War to the early stages of American mall culture. Season 20 shows them with smartphones and social media. Season 36 references streaming services and current political situations. The Simpsons exist in whichever decade you're watching them from, and the show expects you to accept this without questioning it too deeply. Major events in the Simpson family's present-day timeline include countless disasters, near-death experiences, and dramatic situations that should fundamentally alter their lives, but never actually do. Homer has changed jobs dozens of times only to end up back at the nuclear plant. The family has moved away from Springfield multiple times, but always returns. Characters have died, come back to life, or had their deaths retconned. Relationships have formed and dissolved. Secrets have been revealed and then forgotten. Some events seem to stick as canon even as others fade away. Maud Flanders died in the year 2000 when she was hit by T-shirts fired from guns at a racetrack, as shown in the episode Alone Again, Natra Diddley. This death was permanent and has affected Ned Flanders' character development ever since. Marge's mother, Jackie Bouvier, has aged and died in some episodes, but appears alive and well in others. Edna Crabapple, Bart's 4th grade teacher, died when her voice actress Marsha Wallace passed away, and the show retired the character out of respect. The present-day timeline includes Springfield evolving from a relatively normal American town into something increasingly absurd. The corruption of Mayor Quimby has become more blatant. The environmental devastation caused by the nuclear plant has gotten worse. The school system has declined to the point where it's barely functional. The police force has become almost comically incompetent, and yet people continue living there, accepting the dysfunction as normal because it's all they know. Certain annual events mark the passage of time within this frozen present. Every year includes a Halloween episode that's explicitly non-canon, allowing the writers to tell horror stories and kill characters without consequences. Every Christmas brings a new holiday special, usually with some variation on the family coming together despite their differences. Thanksgiving episodes often feature Homer's spectacular failures at providing a proper feast. These recurring seasonal episodes give the illusion of time passing, while the characters remain ageless. The show has also dealt with contemporary disasters and tragedies, sometimes well and sometimes poorly. After September 11th, 2001, episodes started including casual references to increased security and fear of terrorism. The 2008 financial crisis was mentioned in episodes dealing with economic hardship. The COVID-19 pandemic was acknowledged in later seasons, though the show mostly avoided making it a major plot point. The Simpsons timeline exists in our world even as it refuses to age with it. Technology has presented one of the biggest challenges for maintaining the show's continuity. Early episodes showed the family with a landline phone, no computers, and entertainment limited to television and video games. As technology advanced in the real world, it advanced in Springfield too. The Simpsons got internet access, though Homer still doesn't really understand how it works. The kids got smartphones, though Bart primarily uses his for pranks. The family joined social media, though Marge finds it confusing, and Homer uses it to argue with strangers. This technological advancement creates weird contradictions when you think about it too hard. If the show is set in the present and smartphones exist now, then flashbacks to when Homer and Marge were dating should also include modern technology, since they supposedly met not that long ago in story terms. But the flashbacks still show the 70s or 90s, depending on the episode, because that's when those relationships actually formed, even though the math doesn't work anymore. The Simpson family's financial situation has remained consistent, even as everything else changes. They're always struggling to pay bills, always one disaster away from financial ruin, but never actually losing the house or going bankrupt permanently. Homer's salary at the nuclear plant has somehow kept pace with inflation, despite Burns being notoriously cheap. The family can afford occasional vacations, new cars when the old ones are destroyed, and enough food to keep Homer's massive appetite satisfied. And they're poor, but not devastatingly so. Working class, but not homeless. Education has been another constant in the present-day timeline. Bart is perpetually in 4th grade with Mrs. Krabappel, though Ned Flanders has taken over teaching duties since Edna's death. Lisa is always in 2nd grade, always the smartest kid in her class, always frustrated by the low standards of Springfield Elementary. Maggie is always either a baby at home or occasionally shown in daycare. The fact that none of them ever advance grades is just accepted as how the show works. Relationships have evolved within the constraints of the frozen timeline. Moe has been romantically involved with multiple women over the years, but always ends up alone. Barney has quit drinking and relapsed several times. Smithers' closeted homosexuality became an open secret, and eventually he came out, though his feelings for Burns remain unrequited. Comic Book Guy has actually gotten married, which represents one of the few permanent character developments the show has allowed. The present-day timeline includes several major environmental and civic disasters that should have destroyed Springfield, but somehow didn't. The nuclear plant has had multiple meltdowns that would have rendered the area uninhabitable. The town has been domed by the EPA for pollution. Natural disasters have leveled buildings. Mob violence has burned down parts of the city. And yet Springfield always bounces back, rebuilt and ready for the next catastrophe. The town is either incredibly resilient or just too stubborn to admit defeat. Over 36 seasons and counting, the present day in The Simpsons has become its own special kind of time period. It's eternally contemporary, always relevant, perpetually now, but never moving forward. The family experiences events, learns lessons, and grows emotionally. But then the next episode resets them back to their baseline. They're trapped in a loop of their own present, aging in real time for viewers but frozen forever at the same ages in the show. It's a temporal paradox that the show acknowledges occasionally through meta-jokes, but never actually resolves. The floating timeline explained. To understand how The Simpsons timeline works, or rather, how it deliberately doesn't work, you need to understand the concept of a floating timeline. This is a storytelling device used by long-running shows, where the characters remain the same age, but the present continuously updates to match when the episodes are being produced and aired. The past gets rewritten regularly to maintain a consistent distance between the characters' ages and the current year, while the future remains undefined and changeable. The necessity for a floating timeline becomes obvious when you do the math. When The Simpsons started in 1989, having Homer and Marge meet in high school in 1974 made perfect sense. That put them at 33 years old, which matched Homer's stated age. Bart being born in 1980 and being 9 or 10 years old in 1989 worked perfectly. But as years passed and the show continued, these dates became increasingly problematic. By 2000, Homer would have been 44 if he was born in 1956. By 2010, he'd be 54. By 2020, he'd be 64 years old, well past the age where his lifestyle of constant beer drinking, donut eating, and physical comedy made any sense. The show couldn't let Homer actually age into his 60s while pretending he was still a middle-aged man with young children. Something had to give, and what gave was the concept of a fixed timeline. Instead of letting the characters age realistically, the show's writers decided to keep everyone at the same ages forever, while moving the historical events of their lives forward in time. This means that with each passing year, Homer and Marge's high school days move 1 year closer to the present. The year they met, and which was 1974 in early episodes, became the mid-80s in later episodes, then the 90s, and now, presumably, the 2000s or later. Their ages stay the same, but the distance between their current age and their teenage years remains constant. This creates some fascinating contradictions when you compare episodes from different eras. The original version of Homer and Marge's first meeting in The Way We Was showed them in a definitively 1970s setting complete with period-appropriate music, fashion, and cultural references. Marge attended a feminist rally that felt very specifically like something that would happen in the 70s. The songs playing at their prom were from that era. The cars, the clothes, the general aesthetic all screamed 1974. But later episodes like That 90s Show attempted to move their youth to the 90s, showing Homer in a grunge band and Marge attending college during the rise of alternative rock culture. This created immediate backlash from fans because it contradicted not just the dates, but the entire tone and characterization established in earlier flashbacks. The show eventually soft retconned that 90s show, with writers essentially pretending it never happened while occasionally throwing in references to the 90s anyway. The floating timeline affects different characters in different ways. For someone like Grandpa Simpson, whose entire identity is built around being old and having lived through historical events, the timeline has become increasingly impossible. His World War II service made perfect sense when the show started, but as mentioned earlier, it's now mathematically absurd. A person who fought in World War II and is still alive today would be at minimum 100 years old, which is much older than Grandpa is portrayed as being. The show dealt with this by essentially abandoning Grandpa's World War II backstory in recent seasons. Episodes still occasionally reference his military service, but they're vaguer about which war he fought in or when it happened. The Flying Hellfish, his wartime unit that was central to several episodes, has been quietly retired from continuity. This erasure of established character history shows both the flexibility and the costs of the floating timeline approach. For other characters, the floating timeline creates less dramatic but still notable changes, and characters who were originally conceived as being from specific eras now have to be reimagined for different time periods. Dr. Hibbert's background as someone who lived through the civil rights movement made sense when he would have been young during the 60s, but that connection weakens as his timeline moves forward. Moe's history as someone who was involved in specific historical events from the 70s and 80s gets fuzzier as those decades recede further into the past. The floating timeline particularly affects pop culture references. Early episodes could make jokes about current events from the late 80s and early 90s, knowing those events were fresh in viewers' minds. But as the show continued, and it had to balance making contemporary references with the fact that its characters supposedly lived through different decades. A character in their 30s in 2025 didn't grow up with the same cultural touchstones as someone in their 30s in 1990. Yet Homer and Marge are both simultaneously. Technology presents another massive challenge for the floating timeline. When the show started, personal computers were just becoming common in American homes. Cell phones were rare and expensive. The internet didn't exist in its modern form. Characters could reasonably not have access to these technologies. But as technology became ubiquitous in the real world, it had to exist in Springfield too, creating anachronisms when compared to earlier episodes showing the same time period. The most brain-breaking aspect of the floating timeline is what it does to Christmas and birthdays. The show has aired dozens of Christmas episodes over its run, each supposedly showing the Simpson family celebrating Christmas in the current year. But if these episodes are all canon, then the family has celebrated over 30 Christmases while the kids remain the same age. Either they're trapped in a temporal loop, or Christmas happens multiple times per year in their universe. The show occasionally acknowledges these contradictions through meta-humor. Characters will make jokes about never aging, about the show having been on forever, about how it's weird that Lisa has been in second grade for decades. These fourth wall breaking moments let the audience know that yes, the writers are aware of the impossibility of what they're doing, and they think it's funny too. But acknowledging the problem doesn't solve it. It just makes the impossibility part of the joke. Some events do seem to stick across the timeline, while others get erased or rewritten. Maud Flanders' death remains canon despite the date of her death moving forward with the floating timeline. The birth order of the Simpson children stays consistent even as the dates of their births change. Major character revelations like Smithers being gay or Frank Grimes working at the plant and dying are treated as permanent parts of the show's history, even though the specific years they happened keep shifting. The floating timeline also affects how we interpret characters' ages and life experiences. Is Homer a Gen Xer who grew up in the 70s and 80s, or a millennial who came of age in the 90s and 2000s? The answer depends on when you're watching. His age stays the same, but his generation identity shifts with the timeline. This creates interesting questions about whether someone's personality and values are inherent to them or shaped by their generational experiences. For long-time viewers, the floating timeline can be disorienting. Episodes you remember watching when they first aired, showing flashbacks to events that happened 20 or 30 years before the episode, are now showing flashbacks to events that supposedly happened 10 or 15 years ago. Your memory of when something aired conflicts with when the show's internal timeline says it happened. This creates a weird temporal disconnect between your experience as a viewer and the show's internal continuity. The ultimate truth about The Simpsons' floating timeline is that it prioritizes staying relevant over maintaining consistency. The show would rather update its references, technology, and cultural touchstones to match the current moment than preserve a rigid timeline that would make episodes feel dated. This keeps the show accessible to new viewers who aren't familiar with the culture of 1989. But it frustrates long-time fans who remember when continuity mattered more. Future episodes. What's to come? While The Simpsons keeps its present day locked in an eternal now, it has repeatedly jumped forward to show us possible futures for the Simpson family. These flash-forward episodes provide glimpses of what Bart, Lisa, and Maggie might become if they were ever allowed to grow up. Interestingly, these future timelines are just as contradictory as the show's regular continuity, with different episodes presenting completely incompatible visions of what lies ahead for Springfield's most famous family. The first major future episode was Lisa's Wedding from season 6, which aired in 1995. In this episode, a fortune teller at a Renaissance fair shows Lisa a vision of her life in the year 2010. 15-year-old Lisa is skeptical, but watches as her future unfolds. She's shown attending an unnamed university in England, where she's clearly thriving academically. While there, she meets Hugh Parkfield, a sophisticated British student who shares her interest in literature and culture. Lisa and Hugh fall in love and get engaged, planning to marry back in Springfield so Lisa's family can attend, and the episode shows adult Lisa as poised, successful, and on the path to everything she dreamed about as a child. But there's a problem. Hugh is embarrassed by the Simpson family. He finds them crude, unsophisticated, and socially awkward. He wants Lisa to embrace his world and leave her Springfield roots behind. This comes to a head when Hugh reveals he doesn't want to honor any Simpson family traditions at their wedding. Lisa realizes she has to choose between the life she wants and the family she loves. In a moment that defines her character, she calls off the wedding rather than marry someone who's ashamed of where she comes from. She returns to Springfield heartbroken, but certain she made the right choice. The episode ends with the fortune teller's booth closing, leaving ambiguous whether this future was real or just one possible path Lisa might take. Lisa's Wedding established several things about The Simpsons' future that would recur in later episodes. Homer and Marge are still together and still living in the Evergreen Terrace house. Homer is still working at the nuclear plant. Bart is underachieving as an adult, working in construction and demolition. Maggie has developed an amazing singing voice, but still doesn't speak. The core Simpson family dynamics remain intact, even as the kids grow into adults, suggesting that some things never change, no matter how much time passes. The second major future episode was Bart to the Future from season 11, airing in 2000. This episode takes a very different approach, by showing Bart a vision of his life 30 years in the future through a mystic Native American casino manager. The future presented here is much darker for Bart personally, but more optimistic for Lisa professionally. In this timeline, Bart has become a washed-up musician, living with his roommate Ralph Wiggum in what appears to be a beach apartment. He never achieved the success he dreamed of, and has spent years mooching off his parents and anyone else who'll support him. He owns a bar with Nelson Muntz, but they're barely getting by. Bart represents everything you fear you might become. Someone with potential who never applied themselves and ended up exactly nowhere. Meanwhile, Lisa has been elected President of the United States, becoming the first straight female president, according to the episode's joke, as she's inherited a massive budget crisis from her predecessor, Donald Trump, in a piece of satire that would prove eerily prescient when Trump actually became president years later. Lisa is trying to fix the country's finances and govern responsibly, but she's hampered by the mess left by previous administrations and by her own tendency to trust people who don't deserve it. The most poignant moment in Bart to the Future comes when Lisa needs Bart to grow up and help her, but he's still behaving like an irresponsible teenager despite being in his 40s. Their relationship as adults mirrors their childhood dynamic, with Lisa trying to do the right thing while Bart creates chaos. But there's genuine affection between them too, suggesting that even when Bart disappoints her, Lisa never stops being his sister. And this episode presented a future that felt pessimistic, especially for Bart. It suggested that his childhood personality would calcify into adult failure, that his lack of application and constant rebellion would prevent him from ever finding success or happiness. For Lisa, the future looked brighter professionally, but showed her still dealing with the same frustrations about people not taking her seriously and about having to clean up other people's messes. Season 16's future drama showed yet another version of the Simpson kids' future, this time focusing on their graduation from high school. Through Professor Frink's future machine, Bart and Lisa see themselves as teenagers 8 years in the future. Lisa is dating Milhouse Van Houten. Bart is dating a girl named Genda, and both are preparing to graduate from Springfield High. The episode reveals that Bart is up for a scholarship to Yale, competing against Lisa for the spot. This represents a version of Bart who applied himself more than the one in Bart to the Future, suggesting that different choices could lead to different outcomes. In a moment of redemption, Bart gives the scholarship to Lisa instead, recognizing that she deserves it more and will make better use of the opportunity. This version of teenage Bart shows more growth and maturity than many adult versions we've seen. Future drama also showed Homer and Marge temporarily separated, with Marge having left Homer after he spent their life savings on an underwater house. This was one of the first future episodes to suggest the Simpson marriage might not last forever, adding tension to what had always been portrayed as an unbreakable bond. Of course, they reconcile by the episode's end, because some things really don't change, even in possible futures. The most beloved future episode is Holidays of Future Past from season 23, airing in 2011. This episode jumped 30 years into the future. setting it in 2041, and presented what many fans consider the most emotionally satisfying vision of the Simpson family's future. The writers conceived it as a potential series finale, showing how the family might end up if the show ever concluded. In this timeline, Bart is divorced from Gender and has two sons, Jiff and Skippy, who resent their deadbeat dad. He's living in a converted Springfield elementary building and struggling to connect with his children. Lisa is married to Milhouse and has a rebellious teenage daughter named Zia, who reminds Lisa uncomfortably of her own childhood relationship with authority. Maggie has become a world-famous rock star and is pregnant with her first child. Homer and Marge are elderly, but still together, still living in the same house, still fundamentally themselves. What makes Holidays of Future Past special is how it deals with the emotional reality of the Simpson kids becoming parents themselves. Bart struggles with being the kind of father Homer was to him, making the same mistakes and wondering why his kids don't respect him. Lisa tries to connect with Zia, but finds that her daughter rebels against her the way Lisa once rebelled against Homer. Both of them return to their childhood home for Christmas and find comfort in being children again, even if just for a moment. The episode includes some genuinely touching moments, particularly Homer's advice to his adult children about parenting, and Grandpa being kept alive in cryogenic storage so the family can unfreeze him for holidays. There's a beautiful scene where adult Bart and Lisa bond in their old treehouse, talking honestly about how hard it is to be parents and how they finally understand what their parents went through. It suggests that growing up doesn't mean you stop needing your family. It just changes how you need them. Season 25's Days of Future continued the Holidays of Future Past timeline, but took it in a much stranger direction. Set even further in the future, this episode deals with Homer dying repeatedly and being cloned each time, Milhouse being turned into a zombie, and an increasingly bizarre science fiction elements that make it hard to take seriously. Most fans consider this episode non-canon, even compared to other future episodes. There have been other glimpses of possible futures throughout the series. Barthood showed Bart aging from childhood through his teenage years in a parody of the film Boyhood. Mr. Lisa's Opus focused on Lisa's journey from child to Harvard student. Multiple Treehouse of Horror episodes have shown apocalyptic futures or alternate timelines. Each provides a different version of what might happen if the Simpson family was allowed to age naturally. The contradictions between these future episodes are numerous and obvious. In some futures, Bart is married to Gender. In others, he's alone or with different partners. Lisa marries Hugh in one timeline, but Milhouse in several others. And there are hints she might end up with Nelson in yet another version. Maggie's future varies from being a rock star to being an accomplished musician to following other paths entirely. The only constants are that Homer and Marge stay together and that the kids all have complicated relationships with their parents. What's interesting about these future episodes is what they tell us about how the show's writers view their characters' potential. Bart is almost always shown as underachieving in adulthood, suggesting the writers believe his rebellious nature will prevent him from finding conventional success. Lisa is almost always successful professionally, but struggles personally, unable to find the balance between her ambitions and her relationships. Maggie consistently becomes talented and accomplished while maintaining her silence, making her the quietest success story in the family. These future episodes serve multiple purposes. They let the writers explore what might happen if the show's eternal present ever ended. They provide emotional catharsis by showing the Simpson kids as functional adults despite their chaotic childhoods. They allow for social commentary about the future of technology, politics, and society through a Simpsons lens. And most importantly, they remind us that even though the characters can't age in the show's present, their potential futures remain infinite and hopeful. Side characters and their timelines. While the Simpson family's timeline is complicated enough, and the supporting characters of Springfield exist in their own temporal paradoxes that make even less sense when you examine them closely. These side characters have backstories that span decades or even centuries, yet they remain frozen at the same ages alongside the main family. Some of them, particularly Montgomery Burns, have timelines that are physically impossible even by the show's own loose standards. Charles Montgomery Burns represents the most extreme example of temporal impossibility in The Simpsons. His age has been stated variously as 81 in the episode Simpson and Delilah, 89, 104, and even higher in different episodes. At one point, when entering his PIN number, which he says is his age, he types 4 digits, suggesting he's over 1,000 years old, and he's claimed to have been born in 1886, which would make him over 130 years old when the show started. But he's also been shown as the same age or younger than Grandpa Simpson in flashbacks, despite being significantly older in the present, creating yet another timeline impossibility. Burns' backstory includes fighting in World War II alongside Grandpa Simpson as a member of the Flying Hellfish. He also claims to have been in World War I, though he would have been in his 30s by then if he was born in 1886. He's been shown as a young man during the Great Depression, as a college student at Yale in the early 1900s, and even as existing during the Civil War when a Colonel Burns appears in historical records. The show has even made jokes about him being born in Pangaea, the ancient supercontinent that existed 200 million years ago, in what's clearly meant to be an absurdist exaggeration of his impossible age. The key to understanding Burns' timeline is that it's deliberately absurd. His impossible age is part of the joke. He's so old and so evil that he's essentially immortal, sustained by pure greed and malice. The writers intentionally make his backstory contradictory because the humor comes from the impossibility. Burns has lived multiple lifetimes, participated in impossible historical events, and somehow remained alive through a combination of wealth, spite, and cartoon logic. Ned Flanders presents a different type of timeline problem. He's supposed to be roughly the same age as Homer, maybe slightly older based on their interactions. They were neighbors growing up, attended Springfield University around the same time, and have children of similar ages. But Flanders' backstory includes elements that don't fit this timeline. He's mentioned being a child in the late 50s and early 60s, which would make him significantly older than Homer. His parents were beatniks who raised him without discipline, but beatniks were primarily a 50s and early 60s phenomenon. Flanders also has a mysteriously tragic past involving his first wife Maud's death in the year 2000. Since Maud was supposedly around the same age as Ned, and they'd been married since the 70s based on flashback episodes, her death should have aged Ned significantly, or at least changed his timeline. But in episodes after her death, our flashbacks still show Ned and Maud meeting and marrying at ages that don't quite work if the present keeps moving forward with the floating timeline. Mo Seislak has one of the most confusing backstories in Springfield. He claims to have been various ages, from in his 40s to in his 60s depending on the episode. His past includes being a boxer in the 50s and 60s, working with the mob in the 70s, and having relationships that span multiple decades. He was apparently in high school with Homer and Barney, but he's clearly much older than them in the present, based on his appearance and the experiences he references. He's also claimed to have been married in the 70s and to have had children, though neither appears in the show's present day, suggesting entire lives that have been erased from continuity. Principal Skinner's timeline is particularly messy because the show famously retconned his entire identity in the episode The Principal and the Pauper. That episode revealed that the man Springfield knows as Seymour Skinner is actually Armin Tamzarian, who assumed a missing soldier's identity after Vietnam. This twist was so unpopular with fans and critics that the show essentially pretended it never happened in subsequent episodes, but it created questions about Skinner's real age and history that were never satisfactorily answered. If Skinner is who he says he is, he served in Vietnam in the late 60s and early 70s, which would make him at least in his 60s in the current timeline. But he's portrayed as being significantly younger, probably in his 40s or 50s. His relationship with his mother Agnes doesn't make sense if he's actually Tamzarian, because she's not his real mother, and his entire backstory about growing up in Springfield becomes questionable if he only arrived in town after the war. Krusty the Clown's timeline involves him being a performer since at least the 1950s, based on references to his early television work. He's mentioned performing on early television, which would make him quite old in the present day. He's had multiple heart attacks, survived numerous scandals, and been in show business for what should be 70 years. Yet he continues performing and appears to be somewhere in his 50s or 60s, rather than his 80s or 90s. His relationship with his father, Rabbi Hyman Krustofsky, who died in the show, and also creates timeline questions about when Krusty was born and how old he should be. Barney Gumble was Homer's best friend in high school, and they're supposed to be the same age based on the way we was. But Barney has a backstory that includes being a brilliant student who gave up his Harvard scholarship to become an alcoholic. The show has suggested this happened because of Homer's influence, but the timeline of when this occurred and how long Barney has been drinking varies from episode to episode. He's been sober and relapsed multiple times over the show's run, adding layers of timeline confusion to an already unclear history. Smithers' age is particularly confusing because he's been shown as a child when Homer was 12 years old in the episode The Blunder Years, suggesting he's younger than Homer by several years. But he's also been depicted as being in high school or college at the same time as Homer and Marge in other flashbacks. His devotion to Burns would make more sense if he grew up with Burns as a father figure, especially since his father died saving the nuclear plant. But some episodes suggest they met when Smithers was already an adult, creating yet another contradiction. Chief Wiggum and other Springfield police officers have backstories suggesting they've been on the force for decades, yet they remain roughly the same age as when the show started. Wiggum has mentioned being a cop since the 70s, which would make him at least in his 60s in the current timeline, based on when police academies typically accept recruits. But he's portrayed as being in his 40s or 50s. His son Ralph is perpetually in elementary school, despite Wiggum having supposedly been a cop long enough to retire with a pension. The Bouvier sisters, Patty and Selma, should be significantly older than Marge since they're her older sisters, but they seem to be roughly the same age in the present, maybe just a few years older. They've had jobs at the DMV for what's implied to be decades, based on their complaints about how long they've worked there. yet they don't appear to age or retire. Their hatred of Homer dates back to when he started dating Marge in high school, which keeps getting pushed further into the past as the floating timeline advances. Dr. Hibbert has been Springfield's primary physician for what seems like the entire run of the show, but his age and background keep shifting, and he's mentioned being in medical school in the 70s, being a doctor in the 80s, and having a family history that spans multiple generations. Yet he remains roughly middle-aged throughout the show's run, never aging toward retirement, despite having practiced medicine for supposedly decades. Groundskeeper Willie's backstory includes immigrating from Scotland as a young man, working various jobs before ending up at Springfield Elementary. But when this immigration occurred and how long he's been at the school varies from episode to episode. He should be aging into his 50s or 60s based on early references to when he arrived in America, but he maintains the same level of physical strength and energy he's always had. These side characters exist in the same temporal freeze as the main family, but their backstories make this freeze even more absurd. They've lived entire lives before the show began, lives that span decades and include historical events that recede further into the past as the present moves forward. Their ages should be calculable based on when they participated in these events, but the math never works out. They're all simultaneously too young and too old for their own histories. The show occasionally acknowledges these impossibilities through jokes about characters never aging or about events that should have killed them long ago. But mostly, it just expects viewers to accept that Springfield exists outside normal time, where people can have impossibly long backstories while remaining perpetually middle-aged. The side characters' timelines are broken in the same way the main characters' timelines are broken. But because they're not the focus of the show, the contradictions are easier to ignore. Springfield's recurring institutions and their histories beyond individual characters. Springfield itself has institutions that have existed throughout the show's run, with their own impossible timelines. These establishments, from Moe's Tavern to Springfield Elementary, have backstories that stretch back decades or even centuries, yet they remain fundamentally unchanged despite everything that happens to them. Understanding these institutions helps explain how Springfield maintains its identity, even as the timeline constantly shifts around it. Moe's Tavern stands as one of Springfield's oldest, continuously operating businesses. Moe has run the bar for what appears to be decades based on his references to serving different generations of drinkers. The building itself has been depicted in flashbacks going back to the 1930s, sometimes as Moe's establishment and sometimes under different ownership. The bar has burned down, been rebuilt, been shut down by health inspectors, and suffered countless other disasters. Yet it always returns to its dingy, depressing state. What makes Moe's timeline particularly interesting is how it serves as a constant in Springfield's history. Homer has been drinking there since he was in his 20s based on flashback episodes, yet Moe looks the same age he did when Homer first walked in decades ago. The bar's regular customers, Barney, Carl, and Lenny, have apparently been gathering there for just as long without any of them aging, and this suggests that Moe's exists outside normal time as a place where Springfield's working class men can escape from their lives regardless of what decade they're in. The Krusty Burger fast food chain and the Krusty the Clown Empire represent another long-running Springfield institution. Krusty's show has supposedly been on the air since the 1950s, based on references to his early television work. This means multiple generations of Springfield children have grown up watching Krusty, including characters who are now adults with children of their own. The show has maintained its format and basic content for over 60 years without significant changes, which reflects how children's entertainment often stays frozen in time, even as everything else evolves. And Springfield Elementary School has an especially convoluted history. The building has been shown in various states throughout different time periods, sometimes looking modern and well-maintained, other times appearing as the decrepit structure we see in present-day episodes. Principal Skinner has been running the school for decades based on his own statements, though as discussed earlier, his age and history don't make sense. The school has educated multiple generations of Springfieldians, from Grandpa Simpson through Homer to Bart and Lisa. Yet the building and staff remain largely unchanged. The school's timeline becomes particularly confusing when you consider that many current adults attended Springfield Elementary as children. Homer, Marge, Lenny, Carl, Barney, and numerous others all went to the same school their children now attend. And this would be normal, except that the floating timeline means these adults were children at constantly changing points in the past. The school somehow educated students in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, despite existing in a present where Bart has been in 4th grade for over 30 years. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant opened in 1968, according to the episode Homer's Odyssey, though other episodes suggest different founding dates. Montgomery Burns built the plant as one of his many business ventures, and it's been polluting Springfield ever since. The plant has had numerous accidents, safety violations, and near meltdowns over its history. Employee turnover seems surprisingly low considering how dangerous the workplace is, with many workers having been there for decades despite the health risks. Homer's employment at the plant represents one of the few consistent elements of his adult life across the entire series. He's worked there since shortly after Bart was born in most timeline versions, meaning he's held the same job for over a decade in story time, while the show has run for over 30 years in real time. His incompetence has somehow never resulted in permanent termination, suggesting either that Burns values loyalty over competence, or that Homer has plot armor protecting his employment. The Springfield Police Department has an unclear history, but has clearly been dysfunctional for generations. Chief Wiggum inherited his position from his father in some timeline versions, suggesting that corruption and incompetence run in the family. The police force has been shown in flashbacks from various decades, always displaying the same low standards and questionable ethics. This consistency of dysfunction suggests that Springfield's problems aren't new, but rather part of the town's character, stretching back through its entire history. Springfield's church, where Reverend Lovejoy preaches, has existed since the town's founding based on references to the building's age. The church has served as the moral center of the community for over 2 centuries, though how seriously residents take that moral guidance varies considerably. Lovejoy himself has been the Reverend for decades based on his references to serving past generations of Springfieldians, yet he remains roughly the same age he's always been. Add the concept of a religious institution remaining constant, while the world changes around it, fits with how churches often function in real communities. The Springfield Church represents tradition and continuity in a town that's constantly experiencing disasters and changes. Whether residents are attending services in the 1800s or the present day, they're participating in the same rituals and hearing similar messages about morality and community values. The Leftorium, Ned Flanders' store for left-handed people, represents a more recent addition to Springfield's commercial landscape, having been opened during the show's run. The episode where Ned opens the store has become part of Springfield's history, Yet the store's success or failure has fluctuated wildly depending on plot needs. By season 29, the Leftorium closes permanently, and Ned becomes Bart's teacher, showing that even newer institutions eventually fall victim to Springfield's economic instability. The Android's Dungeon comic book shop, run by Comic Book Guy, serves as Springfield's center for nerd culture and pop culture commentary. The shop has existed for an unclear amount of time, but Comic Book Guy's references to collecting comics since childhood and his encyclopedic knowledge of pop culture suggest he's been running the store for decades. The shop survives despite having a proprietor who actively insults customers and seems to do everything possible to drive away business. Springfield's media landscape includes the Springfield Shopper newspaper and various television stations that have covered the town's events for generations. Kent Brockman has been a news anchor for decades based on references to his long career, yet he looks the same age he did when Homer and Marge were young. The media institutions of Springfield serve to document the town's history, even as that history keeps getting rewritten by the floating timeline. These institutions create a sense of continuity and community in Springfield that persists despite the temporal impossibilities. When characters visit Moe's Tavern or attend church or shop at the Quickie Mart, they're participating in activities that connect them to generations of Springfieldians before them. The institutions provide stability in a world where personal timelines make no sense, and the past keeps changing. What's particularly interesting is how these institutions reflect real American towns, where the same businesses, schools, and churches serve communities for generations. The impossibility of Springfield's timeline doesn't diminish the emotional truth of having places where people gather across time. Whether it's the 50s, the 90s, or the present day, Springfield residents can walk into Moe's and find familiar faces drinking away familiar problems. The timeline might be broken, but the sense of place remains intact. The impossibilities and contradictions. The Simpsons timeline isn't just complicated, it's genuinely impossible when you examine it closely. The show has created so many contradictions, anachronisms, and historical impossibilities that trying to construct a coherent timeline is like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces are from different sets and none of them fit together properly. But that's part of the point. The Simpsons has never pretended to have a consistent timeline, and the impossibilities are part of the show's charm rather than flaws to be fixed. Let's start with the most obvious impossibility: Grandpa Simpson's military service. As discussed earlier, Abraham Simpson claims to have fought in both World War I and World War II. If he was old enough to fight in World War I, even by lying about his age, he would have been born no later than around 1905. That would make him 84 years old when the show started in 1989. That's not impossible, but it becomes problematic when you factor in the floating timeline. If the show is set in the current year, and Grandpa is 83 or 87 years old, then he was born in either 1934 or 1938. That makes him 5 to 11 years old during World War II and not even born yet during World War I. He couldn't possibly have served in either war. The show eventually had to quietly drop his World War II backstory because maintaining it had become mathematically absurd. But for decades, Grandpa's service in the Flying Hellfish was a core part of his character, creating episodes that now exist in a weird canonical limbo. Burns' participation in World War II creates even bigger problems. If he was born in 1886, as some episodes suggest, he would have been 56 years old when World War II started. That's possible. Men that age did serve, but it's much older than the young soldier he's depicted as in flashbacks. He also would have been 103 years old when the show started, and well over 130 now. The show makes jokes about Burns being ancient, but even by those standards, his timeline makes no sense. The dates of Homer and Marge's youth present massive contradictions as the floating timeline advances. The Way We Was definitively set their high school years in 1974. They were seniors, which would make them born in 1956 or 1957. But as the show continued, maintaining this meant they would age past being believable as parents of young children. So later episodes moved their youth to the 80s, then the 90s, creating a situation where different episodes show them living through completely different decades. This creates cultural anachronisms that are impossible to reconcile. If Homer and Marge were teenagers in the 70s, and their cultural references, music tastes, and formative experiences would be very different than if they were teenagers in the 90s. The show tries to have it both ways, showing them with 70s nostalgia in some episodes and 90s references in others, but they can't both be true simultaneously. Bart's birth date creates similar problems. I Married Marge set his birth in 1980, showing Marge and Homer watching The Empire Strikes Back in theaters and other early 80s cultural touchstones. If Bart was born in 1980, he should be in his mid-40s now, but he's perpetually 10 years old, which means his birth year has to keep moving forward with the floating timeline. Episodes from the past 15 years likely place his birth in the 2000s or later, in completely contradicting the earlier established continuity. Lisa's birth presents the same issue. Various episodes have placed her birth in different years, depending on when they aired. If we accept that she's 2 years younger than Bart, and Bart's birth year keeps shifting, then Lisa's does too. Maggie's birth is even more confusing because different episodes give completely contradictory explanations for how she was conceived and when she was born. The episode And Maggie Makes Three set her birth in the early 90s, but that's impossible if the show is set in the present day with Bart and Lisa still children. Historical events create another layer of impossibility. Characters reference living through specific historical moments that they couldn't have experienced based on their ages. Homer has memories of the Cold War, in the space race, and other events from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even though he should have been too young for most of them if his birth year keeps updating with the timeline. He somehow remembers things that happened before he was born in any version of his timeline. Technology creates massive anachronisms throughout the show. Early episodes showed the Simpson family without computers, internet, or cell phones because those things weren't common in the late 80s. But in the show's internal timeline, those early episodes supposedly took place not that long ago, maybe just a few years before the current episodes. Yet the family has somehow gone from having no internet to everyone having smartphones in what should be a very short time period within the story. Educational progression doesn't make sense either. Bart has been in 4th grade for over 35 years. He should have graduated high school, possibly college, and be starting his own family by now. Lisa has been 8 years old since 1989, meaning she spent over 3 decades in 2nd grade. Maggie has been a baby for longer than most real babies' parents have been alive. None of them age or advance, creating an eternal childhood that's simultaneously heartwarming and unsettling when you think about it. The show's calendar creates impossibilities as well. There have been over 30 Christmas episodes, suggesting the family has celebrated Christmas over 30 times. But if each Christmas happens in a different year and the characters don't age, how does that work? Either they're trapped in a time loop where the same year repeats endlessly, or Christmas happens multiple times per year in their universe. Neither option makes logical sense. Deaths and resurrections create continuity nightmares. Characters like Maud Flanders and Edna Krabappel have died and stayed dead, their deaths becoming permanent parts of the timeline. But other characters have died and come back with no explanation. Some deaths are retconned or ignored in later episodes. The show can't seem to decide whether death is permanent or reversible, making it impossible to know which character deaths actually matter to the timeline. Springfield's geography is intentionally impossible. The city has been shown near mountains, oceans, deserts, and forests, sometimes all in the same episode. It borders states that don't border each other in reality. It's been in the east, the west, the north, and the south depending on which episode you're watching. The show's creator, Matt Groening, has said this is intentional, that Springfield is meant to be everywhere and nowhere. But it creates a timeline problem when you realize the family has supposedly lived in the same house in the same city their entire lives, despite that city being geographically incoherent. Cultural references create anachronisms when the show forgets its own timeline. Episodes set in the past sometimes include references to things that didn't exist yet. Characters in the present reference their memories of events that supposedly happened decades ago, but would have been just a few years back in the show's internal timeline. The show plays fast and loose with what its characters should remember and when they should remember it from. And the episode The Principal and the Pauper created one of the show's most controversial contradictions by revealing Principal Skinner wasn't really Seymour Skinner. This retcon was so unpopular that the show essentially unretconned it, pretending the episode never happened. But it still exists, creating a weird Schrodinger's cat situation where the episode is both canon and not canon simultaneously. Ultimately, The Simpsons timeline is impossible because it's trying to do something fundamentally impossible. Keep characters frozen at the same ages while the world around them constantly updates to reflect contemporary culture. Every contradiction, every anachronism, every historical impossibility stems from this core tension between staying relevant and maintaining continuity. The show chose relevance, and in doing so, and created a timeline that makes no logical sense, but somehow still works emotionally. Conclusion: living in the eternal present. After examining The Simpsons timeline from the founding of Springfield in 1796, through multiple contradictory futures set decades from now, we've discovered something both frustrating and profound. The timeline doesn't exist as a coherent, logical progression of events. Instead, it exists as a series of moments, stories, and character beats that create emotional truth, even when they abandon factual consistency. The Simpsons has learned to exist outside of time, in a perpetual present that somehow encompasses past, present, and future all at once. The show's relationship with its own timeline reveals something interesting about how we consume long-running media. When The Simpsons started, maintaining continuity seemed important. The writers carefully tracked character ages, historical events, and how much time had passed between episodes. But as the show continued year after year, decade after decade, strict continuity became a prison rather than a framework. The choice was either let the characters age realistically, which would fundamentally change the show, or embrace the floating timeline and accept that consistency wasn't as important as staying contemporary and relevant. By choosing the floating timeline, The Simpsons made a bargain with its audience. The show could remain perpetually current, commenting on today's issues and using today's technology. But in exchange, we had to accept that yesterday keeps changing. Homer and Marge met in the 70s until they didn't. Until they met in the 90s instead, and later, possibly, the 2000s. Grandpa fought in World War II until the math made that impossible, and then he quietly didn't anymore. The past is flexible in Springfield, always maintaining the right distance from the present, while never actually existing in any fixed form. What's remarkable is how well this approach has worked. The Simpsons has maintained cultural relevance for over 3 decades by refusing to be locked into any particular era. Modern episodes can reference smartphones, social media, and streaming services without worrying about how those technologies fit with established backstory. The show can comment on current events, satirize contemporary politics, and make jokes about today's celebrities without breaking its own continuity, because its continuity is designed to be broken and reassembled as needed. This temporal flexibility has allowed The Simpsons to function as a commentary on American life across multiple generations. The show has been on the air long enough that people who watched it as children are now watching it with their own children, or even grandchildren. Each generation experiences The Simpsons as a show about their contemporary moment, never realizing that previous generations experienced it as a show about their contemporary moment too. The Simpson family exists in whatever present the viewer is experiencing, making them perpetually relatable across changing times. The future episodes we explored, from Lisa's wedding through Holidays of Future Past, serve as fascinating thought experiments about what might happen if the eternal present ever ended. Had they show us that even if time resumed flowing normally for The Simpsons, some things would remain constant. Homer and Marge would stay together. The kids would grow up, but still struggle with the same basic personality traits. The family would remain fundamentally themselves even as they aged. These episodes suggest that what makes The Simpsons who they are isn't tied to any particular age or time period, but to their essential characters and relationships. The impossibilities and contradictions we documented aren't really flaws in The Simpsons timeline. They're features of a show that's learned to prioritize emotional resonance over logical consistency. When an episode needs Grandpa to have fought in World War II, to tell a meaningful story about trauma and memory, he fought in World War II, regardless of what the math says. When an episode needs Homer and Marge to have met in a specific era to capture a particular cultural moment, they met in that era. Previous episodes be damned. The timeline serves the story, not the other way around. This approach to continuity has influenced how other long-running shows handle their own timelines. Many animated series have followed The Simpsons' lead, keeping characters perpetually young, while updating their surroundings to match contemporary culture. The floating timeline has become a standard tool for shows that want to run for multiple decades without aging their cast. The Simpsons proved it could work, that audiences would accept temporal inconsistency in exchange for cultural relevance. For longtime fans, the shifting timeline can feel like a betrayal of what made the show special in its early years. Those first seasons felt carefully constructed, with attention paid to how events connected and how much time passed between episodes. Watching the show casually retcon its own established history feels like it's erasing the memories we formed while watching. But from another perspective, the willingness to rewrite history keeps the show alive. A Simpsons locked into 1989 continuity would feel like a period piece, nostalgic but dated, appealing only to people who remember that era. The deeper truth is that The Simpsons timeline reflects something about how we experience time in real life. Our memories are unreliable narrators, constantly rewriting the past to fit our present understanding. The cultural moments we think we remember clearly often turn out to have happened differently than we recall. The dates we assign to events in our personal histories shift as we get older and our perspective changes. The Simpsons' fluid timeline mirrors the fluidity of human memory and experience. What makes The Simpsons special isn't its timeline, but what exists beyond any timeline. The characters we've come to know over decades of stories. We understand Homer's desire to be a good father despite his many failings. We recognize Marge's endless patience and quiet strength. We see ourselves in Lisa's struggle to maintain idealism in a cynical world. We empathize with Bart's rebellion against systems that don't serve him. These character truths exist independently of when they were born or how old they're supposed to be. The show has created a Springfield that exists in a special kind of fictional space where time works differently than it does in our world. It's a place where the past is always close enough to reference, but far enough away to have happened in whatever era works best for the story being told. It's a place where the future is always possible, but never arrives. It's a place where the present lasts forever, allowing characters to remain themselves while the world transforms around them. Springfield exists outside our timeline while remaining connected to it. A temporal island where The Simpsons can live indefinitely. As The Simpsons continues into its fourth decade and potentially beyond, the timeline will only become more impossible and more flexible. And Homer and Marge will keep their memories of high school in whatever decade maintains the right distance from the current year. Grandpa will have served in whatever war allows him to be old, but not impossibly ancient. The kids will stay frozen at their current ages while living through countless Christmases and birthdays. The contradictions will multiply. The retcons will accumulate. And somehow, it will all still work because the show isn't really about maintaining a consistent timeline. It's about maintaining consistent characters. The complete timeline of The Simpsons is simultaneously the most detailed and most non-existent timeline in television history. We can trace the founding of Springfield, follow the Simpson family through generations, document major events in the lives of every character, and glimpse multiple possible futures, and yet none of it forms a coherent whole because it was never meant to. The timeline is a tool, not a constraint, something to be used when it helps tell stories and discarded when it doesn't. In the end, The Simpsons has created something unique in pop culture. A family that ages with us without aging themselves, characters who remain fundamentally the same while existing in an ever-changing present, and a timeline that's completely broken yet somehow still meaningful. The show exists in an eternal now, always contemporary, never dated, perpetually relevant despite being impossibly old. The Simpsons family will celebrate their 50th Christmas someday without aging a single year, and will accept it because we've learned that in Springfield, time works differently, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's even necessary for a show that needs to comment on American life while that life keeps changing. So what is the complete timeline of The Simpsons? It's whatever it needs to be for this episode, this story, this moment. It's flexible enough to encompass 3 centuries of Springfield history and multiple possible futures. It's contradictory enough to make logical analysis impossible. It's emotionally true even when factually absurd. It's both meticulously detailed and completely incoherent. It's a timeline that doesn't exist except in the ways that matter. The Simpson family lives in the eternal present, and maybe that's exactly where they belong. not locked in any particular time, but free to exist in all times simultaneously, commenting on our world while remaining outside it. The timeline is broken, and that's what makes it perfect. Because The Simpsons isn't really about when things happened. It's about the fact that they happened at all, that we remember them, and that they meant something to us regardless of whether the dates add up. Thank you for joining me on this journey through The Simpsons' impossible timeline. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the temporal mess that is Springfield history, make sure you're subscribed to the Cartoon Codex for more comprehensive analyses of your favorite animated shows. Hit that like button. Leave a comment about your favorite Simpsons timeline contradiction, and I'll see you in the next video.